Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today we're going to wrap up the history of Volterra Lunatic Asylum. And just as a heads up, I'm going to take the next 2 weeks off for the holidays, but I will still be recording for Patreon. I haven't had a good amount of time to create and upload materials for the Patreon page, so I want to take a little while to prioritize that. I've already added and will be adding more some journal entries from a former patient at Volterra. I'm also re-recording episodes in video format, so you can be looking for those there. If there's anything else that you'd like to see on Patreon, especially if you're already a member, please let me know. As always, you can get a hold of me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. Trigger warnings for this episode include mention of inhumane treatment practices, medical experimentation during the fascist regime, as well as outdated and ableist language. My main sources for this episode will be the Volterra Asylum website and an article by John Foote called Franco Basaglia and the Radical Psychiatric Movement in Italy, 1961 to 1978. All other sources will be listed at the end of the episode transcript. So for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Volterra Lunatic Asylum. We ended the last episode in 1948 when Italy became a republic. There was so much going on during World War II that it was difficult to capture everything that was happening. In particular, I want to discuss some of the treatments that were happening at Volterra during this time. Under Mussolini's regime, conditions at Volterra and other psychiatric facilities around the country deteriorated considerably. Patients lost not only their dignity, but many of their basic human rights as a result of international isolation, the drive to control deviant behaviors, and for obvious political reasons. It was during the fascist years, in 1938, that Italian psychiatrist Ugo Cerletti invented the treatment that became known as electroshock therapy. This treatment began to be used at Volterra and other hospitals. Like many other hospitals of the time, Volterra used metrazole and insulin shock therapy to induce comas in patients. Doctors believed that this would settle the patients who were experiencing mania or psychosis. The treatments were generally conducted several times per week. But Volterra became known for something else that was disturbing. According to the Manicomio di Volterra website, quote, Dr. Mariani contributed to the effectiveness of malaria therapy by establishing an Anopheles mosquito breeding center in 1939. This center supplied infected mosquitoes throughout Italy to induce benign tertian malaria for therapeutic purposes, especially for syphilis patients with progressive paralysis, end quote. We've talked about malaria therapy before in previous episodes, but this is the first time that I've heard of a hospital having a mosquito breeding center for this type of treatment. Malaria treatment was first used to treat symptoms of syphilis. The malaria would induce a high fever, which would kill off the syphilitic spirochetes, and then quinine, a malaria treatment, would be used to bring down the fever and treat the malaria. Later, however, malaria treatment started to be used in experiments to treat other conditions. And that's where the first treating physician we'll discuss today comes in. Dr. Claus Schilling was a specialist in tropical medicine. So when he learned that Volterra was the place to be for malaria treatment and quinine production, he signed himself up. And he began not, quote, treating patients with malaria therapy, but rather experimenting on them. According to the Volterra website, quote, the experiments, which had no therapeutic goals, consisted of injecting increasing quantities of schizons into psychiatric patients against their will. And just a side note that schizons are the malaria parasites. Schilling mistakenly believed that he had discovered an effective vaccination when these subjects showed no symptoms after being injected with a serum mixture consisting of anti-schizont antibodies and schizonts. There was a basic flaw that made the experiment wrong, namely the demonstrated lack of immunization against sporozoites. In 1939, the Italian authorities blocked his studies at San Nicolo in Siena. But Dr. Schilling, despite the ban and growing doubts in the Italian scientific world about the results achieved, continued his research between March and November of 1941, injecting schizons in increasing quantities, also into patients not affected by progressive paralysis at the psychiatric hospital of Volterra, end quote. And something about his willingness to experiment on vulnerable people, no matter the cost, appealed to none other than Nazi Germany. In March of 1941, Dr. Schilling moved from Volterra to Rome, where he offered his services at the German embassy. He was particularly interested in seeing how he could help German soldiers who had been impacted by malaria in Bulgaria and Greece. Dr. Schiller did so well in this task that in 1942 he was given a special assignment by SS leader Heinrich Himmler. He would be conducting a, quote, special malaria research station in the Dachau concentration camp. According to the Volterra website, over 1,000 prisoners at Dachau were used in malaria experiments there, and of that number, somewhere between 300 to 400 died as a result. Of the survivors, a considerable number were permanently damaged afterward. After the war ended, Dr. Schilling was tried during the trials at Nuremberg and sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging on May 28, 1946. Suffice it to say that left an indelible mark on the treatment at Volterra, even after the end of the war and the fascist regime. Italy was scrambling to rebuild after 20 years of oppression under Mussolini. In the early years of the Republic, Italy was able to rebuild its basic industries to pre-war levels. The economy faced an economic miracle as industrial growth rates increased over 8% each year. Italy was no longer known as a purely agricultural society, but it was starting to be known for its industrial goods, fashion, shoes, luxury cars, and so on. Business was starting to boom. In 1948 at Volterra, two of the pavilions, Bianchi and Cairuggi, started to be used as re-education centers for minors. You may remember from previous episodes that we've discussed how youth culture was affected in the decade following World War II. Young people around the world experienced higher than previous amounts of hooliganism and crime. This was attributed to mental illness, so many of those young folks were hospitalized as a result. Now, fast forward a couple of years, and Amintore Fanfani became Prime Minister of Italy. I should point out that in true Italian style, Fanfani served as prime minister 3 different times during a 6-year span. He was particularly progressive in moving the country forward. He passed measures in education reform, nationalization, public housing, and health. In 1958, after years of discussion and debate, Italian Parliament finally approved a law that led to the start of the Ministry of Health. This would help oversee health services throughout Italy. It was around this time that the second physician we'll discuss today comes into play. So just know that we're going to deviate for a bit away from Volterra, but we'll come back. In 1958, a young doctor named Franco Basaglia had been told that his job as an assistant at the university in Padua, in northern Italy, was basically going nowhere. Dr. Basaglia was from Venice and had grown up during the fascist regime. He was staunchly anti-fascist, which you might remember from the last episode tended to be frowned upon. In 1944, at age 20, he was caught writing on blackboards all around his university, "Death to the fascists, freedom for the people." He was subsequently arrested and sent to the Santa Maria Maggiore prison in Venice, where he remained until the end of the war in May 1945. He finished his medical studies in 1949 and specialized in the field of nervous and mental diseases by 1952. He served as an assistant at the University of Padua to a well-known psychiatric professor, Giambattista Belloni. He worked in this role for years until, as I mentioned earlier, he was told in no uncertain terms that his job was going nowhere. He ended up working there for 12 years. In 1961, a job opened up for Dr. Basaglia as the director of the mental asylum in Gorizia, in the far northeastern corner of Italy. He had to have been disheartened. Being the director of an asylum was seen as a dead-end job in those days, and Gorizia was so remote and isolated. Still, it was something different than the dead-end job he was already doing. The asylum at Gorizia had 500 patients in 1961, and the powers that be would basically leave him alone to run the place. Since Basaglia was mostly left alone and no one really expected anything from him in his new role, as soon as Dr. Basaglia got to Gorizia, he was appalled at the condition patients were living in and the way they were treated. He was convinced that the entire system was morally bankrupt. In fact, he went so far as to say that the hospital reminded him of the war and his time in prison. He saw no medical benefits from the treatments given at the hospital, and in fact, he believed that the patients' conditions were actually worsening as a result of the environment they were living in. So, what does someone do when they want to change the system from the inside out? Well, in his case, he started reading. Dr. Basaglia was inspired by the newly published books of Michel Foucault and Erving Goffman. He read works by Frantz Fanon and Jean-Paul Sartre, and reading these names makes me smile because I studied many of them during my undergraduate and graduate years. Foucault had just published his well-known book, Madness and Civilization, in 1961, which he had written after working at the Sainte-Anne Hospital in Paris. I haven't read this text, but I did read Discipline and Punishment, which is based on the penal system. Come to think of it, I probably should read Madness and Civilization, since that one's way more in my wheelhouse. But anyway, the idea behind the book is that in a modern sense, mental patients have become seen as non-human. Even the very language used with them is different from the language used with others. Dr. Basaglia was inspired by this, as well as the work of Jean-Paul Sartre, who believed that a person understands the mentally ill by forming a relationship with them, and that pesky diagnoses stand in the way of forming a true working relationship. He already believed that patients were being treated as non-human, or, as he called them, quote, hollow men. So Basaglia put radical reforms into place. Inspired by Foucault, he put an end to restraints. He decreased the amount of electroshock treatments. He opened up walls and tore down fences. In 1965, he made an équipe, a team of like-minded psychiatrists who wanted to see change in the Italian mental health care system. He and his équipe held meetings with patients as a collaborative means to get input into what needed to change. Then he and his team went to Scotland to observe the work of Maxwell Jones at Dingleton. We briefly mentioned Maxwell Jones way back in the early episodes of the show. First, because Maxwell Jones briefly worked at Oregon State Hospital, but second and more relevant here, because he created a concept called the therapeutic community. And Dr. Basaglia was inspired by this concept of the therapeutic community. In all his studies and practical changes at the hospital, Dr. Basaglia began writing prolifically. In 1967, he published the book Che cosa la psichiatria, or What is Psychiatry? His 1968 book, L'istituzione negata, or The Institution Denied, became an immediate bestseller around the world. It was described by some as one of the Bibles of 1968. In that book, he not only outlined theoretical concepts and practical aspects of change, he also included stories and patient interviews. He included descriptions of the asylum and exposed class-based systems. By 1968, he was working less at Gorizia and more on his practical means of changing and updating the mental health system across Italy. 1968 was a turbulent and revolutionary year around the world. I can't even begin to get into all the historic events from that year alone. It was no different in Italy. Around Gorizia, signs began to appear with the slogans, "Freedom is therapeutic," and "The truth is revolutionary." In the words of Bob Dylan, the times they were a-changin'. Tragedy struck in September 1968 when a patient, Giovanni Miklus, was released from Gorizia. On the day of his release, he murdered his wife with a hammer. Critics were quick to blame Dr. Basaglia and his radical ideas. Dr. Basaglia and his colleagues were accused of manslaughter, although they were eventually cleared. Although I admittedly don't have any other information on them, I wanted to mention two patients who were apparently instrumental in helping bring about change in Gorizia. Carla Nardini had been in the Auschwitz concentration camp during the war, and Mario Furlan, who later died by suicide, were both noted as patients who helped Dr. Basaglia. After he left Gorizia, Dr. Basaglia served briefly as the director of the asylum in Colorno in Parma, but was a workaholic, so he didn't stay long. He also had a brief stint in New York, working at a Brooklyn hospital for about 6 months. Then, in 1971, he became the director of the asylum in Trieste, also in northeastern Italy. When he began working, there were 1,182 patients without, quote, guest status. And I think that means voluntary patients. He very quickly made similar changes to the hospital as he did in Gorizia, with the eventual plan to shut it all down. He wanted to empty the psych hospitals in Italy of patients, starting with his. And apparently, Basaglia wasn't the only one. Before long, people flooded to Trieste. Psychiatrists, nurses, volunteers. So many people in post-war Italy wanted to see change. Historian John Foote says that Trieste around this time had a sort of magnetic pull for radicals who envisioned change. They believed in Dr. Basaglia's vision that patients shouldn't be treated as they had been, that they should have rights and autonomy and be able to use forks and knives to eat and to have control over their own treatment. Radical, I know. Together they wondered how many people in institutions had been lost to history. It was time to give them back their names, their voices, their dignity. Little by little, Dr. Basaglia's changes came to light. Patients' basic rights were restored. Wards became unlocked. Gender divisions ended, and the hospital divided into sectors in order to help patients move toward discharge. Community housing was set up for them. There were work co-ops set in the community so that patients could leave the hospital with a job waiting for them. There were small meetings held on wards, sometimes every day, to see what could be working better and to give patients a voice in their own treatment. The hospital grounds themselves became a symbol of progress. As John Foote points out, quote, during the 1970s, the psychiatric hospital grounds in Trieste were transformed into an experimental space, hosting art and theatrical projects, exhibitions, plays, conferences, concerts, numerous debates and meetings and international congresses. Militants, students, intellectuals, and practitioners flocked to Trieste. It was a time of extraordinary ferment, end quote. Perhaps most notably were the differences in staffing at Trieste. In Gorizia, Dr. Basaglia had only been able to work with 6 other physicians. But in Trieste, Basaglia, quote, filled the hospital with doctors, volunteers, psychologists, sociologists, militants, artists, and musicians, and emptied it of patients. An incredible 122 people were taken on to work in the asylum under the Basaglia regime, end quote. And the difference was notable. As I previously mentioned, there were 1,182 involuntary patients when Dr. Basaglia started in 1971. By 1974, there were 625. By 1977, there were only 132. Outgoing patients were given cash and housing as they transitioned to the community. Of course, this type of change comes at a price. Dr. Basaglia was constantly fighting against the judicial system and the public in general. There were other incidents, including a tragic murder committed by a recently released patient, Giordano Savrin, in February 1972, who murdered his parents. As in the 1968 incident, Basaglia and his colleagues were tried for manslaughter, but were once again cleared. In either January 1977 or January 1978, my sources weren't entirely clear, Dr. Basaglia made a press conference where he announced that the hospital in Trieste would be shut down by the end of the year. It was an ambitious promise, and it didn't quite happen as quickly as he had hoped. But by the end of 1978, there were only 87 patients left. But his grand gesture must have inspired the government because Parliament approved Law 180, also known as Basaglia's Law, on May 13, 1978. And basically, what this law did was it used Basaglia's experiences at Gorizia, Trieste, and other hospitals as pilot programs to see if shutting down psychiatric facilities would even be possible. The main components of the law would be that new hospital admissions would stop immediately. And after 3 years, admissions of previously admitted patients would no longer be allowed. Compulsory admissions were limited to 15-bed acute facilities for 48 hours, and they could be extended up to 7 days with a judge's order. Dr. Basaglia left Trieste in 1979 and became head of the provincial mental health services in Rome for the province of Lazio. Trieste, meanwhile, closed for good in August 1980. By that time, Dr. Basaglia was obviously very sick and no longer able to work. He died from a brain tumor the same month, on August 29, 1980. The hospital in Trieste was the first hospital in the world to be shut down for political reasons, because Basaglia and his colleagues believed it to function too closely to a concentration camp. Most of Basaglia's critics came out of the woodwork during the 1980s, when he could no longer defend himself or his work. His wife, Franca Ongaro, helped continue his mission of implementing Law 180. It took almost 20 years for the law to have its full effect. According to the Basaglia Law Wikipedia page, quote, the availability of psychiatric beds in Italy is lower than other comparable countries. Italy has 46 psychiatric beds for every 100,000 population, compared with 58 in the United Kingdom and 77 in the US. Law 180 is still considered one of the most radical psychiatric laws in the world. And so with that, I want to bring us back to Volterra, because the history of Franco Basaglia made an enormous impact on hospitals and treatment around Italy. And that brings us to the third physician we'll discuss today, Dr. Gino Basci graduated from medical school in 1967 and was soon hired on at Volterra. He was tasked with managing the Charcot ward, infirmaries for both men and women, and sleep therapy. Like Dr. Basaglia, around the same time, Dr. Basci wanted to make the conditions for patients at the hospital better. But he wasn't in charge of the hospital, so he was limited in what he could do. Starting in March 1969, Dr. Basci became a full-time assistant at Volterra. He reopened 3 wards and started an occupational therapy program that involved paying patients for their work. Yay, we like that. He later established an alcohol center at Volterra that was inspired by the tenets of Alcoholics Anonymous. In 1972, Dr. Basci briefly left Volterra to become the head physician in Reggio Emilia and Cuneo. At the beginning of March 1973, however, he was back at Volterra as head physician. He believed in Dr. Basaglia's tenets of restoring patient dignity and maintaining a right to care. He followed the trends at Trieste and Gorizia at the time and worked to discharge as many patients as possible back to the community. Volterra Lunatic Asylum closed in 1978 after the passage of Law 180. After its closure, Dr. Basci became the head of the Territorial Psychiatric Center in Pisa. And that's the story of Volterra Lunatic Asylum. But I cannot completely share the history of Volterra without telling the story of one infamous patient known as NOF4. Here is his story as told on the Manicomio di Volterra site. Quote, "It was 1958 when Fernando Nanetti, alias NOF4, arrived at the ferry, a judicial pavilion inaugurated in 1933 as the criminal section of the Volterra Asylum, a patient who left an indelible trace of his presence at the Volterra Asylum and whose life from that year onwards would take ever deeper root in the Volterra area." But who was NF4? Fernando Nanetti, registered as Fernando, was born on October 3, 1927 at 11:40 p.m. in Rome, in the Sant'Anna Clinic, to an unknown father and Concetta Nanetti, from whom he took his surname. He apparently chose his second name, Oreste, on his own, but this would not be the only fruit of his creativity. The walls of the ferry, which speak of him, know this well. NOF4 is an acronym for Nanetti Oreste Fernando. 4 could recall in his creative imagination the fact that he is the 4th of 4 children, including brothers and sisters, all non-existent in reality, yet strongly present in his mind. According to another interpretive line instead, undoubtedly more concrete, 4 is the number that links him to Volterra for the assignment to the ferry pavilion, his registration number, his identification. The fact is that behind these signs lies a world, that of a man who during his long stay at the Volterra Asylum tried to leave a trace of himself. Silent, introverted, for many today an artist, a genius of art brute, but between the 30s and 50s of the last century a poor wretch, a demented person then, if not a dangerous mental patient, or by medical definition, simply a schizophrenic. All of this was Fernando Oreste Nanetti, but certainly much more beyond this. Fernando Nanetti before arriving in Volterra. He must not have had an easy life. Born without a father figure to refer to, he began to experience the reality of institutions early, at the age of 7 in 1934, when he was first entrusted to a charity institute for minors, and subsequently transferred to the Forlanini in Rome due to, and I always mispronounce this word, spondylitis, an inflammation of the vertebral skeleton. How his adolescence and youth were spent is not known. Perhaps within the confines of the Institute or in the suburbs, in the search of redemption or normality. These were not easy years for Italy. The Second World War, the Civil War, the not simple Reconstruction. Oreste Fernando Nannetti probably went through all of this too, but we don't know how or exactly where. We only know that he obtained his elementary school diploma. According to some, he worked at Vittoriano, according to others, as an electrician, and it's even presumed that he assisted the futurist Severini. We have no news of him until 1948, when on the threshold of his 21st birthday, he was reported for contempt and resisting a public official. This resulted, on September 29th of the same year, in his acquittal due to mental defect and his detention in the psychiatric hospital Santa Maria della Pieta in Rome. Until 1958, the year of his transfer to Volterra, assigned to the judicial section. Fernando Nannetti in Volterra. Here at 31 years old, Fernando Nannetti arrives at Feri to serve a 2-year sentence. In fact, in 1961, he will be transferred to the dangerous part of Charcot to return to Feri at the end of the 60s, by then to become a former judicial pavilion, the agreement with the Ministry of Justice having expired. But what happens after the Basaglia law comes into force? Nannetti is alone. He has no relatives to return to. After all, he spent a good part of his life between institutions, hospitals, psychiatric detention, and no relative has ever gone to visit him, with the exception of his mental relatives. Pius XIII, Alberto the Monkey, Amadeo of Savoy, the 3 brothers and sisters, etc. And so he remained in Volterra, with a pension from the municipality of Rome at the Bianchi Institute, until January 24th, 1994, the day of his death. He is also buried in Volterra, in the municipal cemetery, and not, as is erroneously believed, in the cemetery of San Finocchi, reserved for the patients of the Volterra Asylum, and therefore no longer in use after 1978. Writing NOF4. Done during the hours of air, 2 a day when the weather permitted, and thanks to the indulgence of the nurses who let him work because he, quote, doesn't bother anyone, NOF4's writing along the Feri wall is in capital letters, curved, reminiscent of Etruscan characters, and to protect his privacy, it is Boustrofeden in scripto continua, not harmonious, ready to bend to follow the line to the heads of the patients, sitting on the bench leaning against the wall. He expertly continues his work, harmonizes the obstacle, tirelessly proceeds with his conversation with the wall, his description of himself, of his world. Oreste Fernando Nannetti is precise. The wall is imposing, and like any self-respecting artist, it is necessary to outline the expressive space. He traces a rectangle, or rather he gives the layout, which he then fills with words, signs, human representations, or geometric designs, hour after hour, day after day. The writing is also a memory of NOF4's past, traces of which are the dialectical inflections, but it also opens up to the description of himself as, quote, astronautical mining engineer of the mental space-time system, and, quote, spinaceous and with an A nose. I don't know what that means, by the way. Somatic characterizations that he shares with his relatives, those born of mental invention, as well as to considerations on the conditions of the patients of the Volterra Asylum. 10% died from magnetic cathodic beatings, 40% from transmitted diseases, 50% from hatred, lack of love, and affection. But who was NOF4 in essence? We could say it in his words, a, quote, materialist and spiritualist, a, quote, free butterfly, quote, one in connection with the telepathic system, or, quote, a holy the Netalicious Mechanicus with a photoelectric cell, end quote. Or more simply, with ours. One like many different people to whom fate has played bad tricks, a life like many others away from comforts and tenderness, a life on the border between inside and outside, between institutions and life, the real one, an existence in the mind, sometimes in delirium, as an escape or redemption from an oppressive reality. Above all, Nanetti was one of us, in his desperate need to communicate his existence, in his own way, by his own means, despite the contingencies. Without a doubt, he succeeded, but at what cost? That of a lifetime, which certainly wasn't enough for him, end quote. And that's where I'll end the history of Volterra Lunatic Asylum and the story of NOF4. Thank you so much for listening. As a reminder, I'm going to take the next 2 weeks off so I can add more to the Patreon page. Thank you so much to everybody who supports the show there and has been incredibly patient as I add content. It's so much easier said than done. Speaking of Patreon, extra special thanks this week to Jay for signing up to be a supporter of the show. Thank you so much. If you'd like to join Patreon for $5 a month after all the new content is added, feel free. You can also support the show on Buzzsprout for $3 a month, but that doesn't come with the cool extra content. But really, you have no idea how much your support means to me. I appreciate it more than I can even say. And thanks to everyone who has joined the Facebook group or followed on Instagram. Really, really, really appreciate it. If you like the show, please give it a 5-star rating and review wherever you're listening. That helps other people find and listen to the show, so that really goes a long way. Happy holidays, however you celebrate, and I hope you come back in a couple of weeks. We'll start talking about a new hospital, one that has been on my list since the very beginning. And as always, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.